Welcome back to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery for our next Facebook Live mystery tour. Today we're behind the scenes at our Rosny site, and we're very excited to have our Senior Conservator of Works on Paper, Cobus van Breda, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the process of conservation and restoration. Before we head in, I'd just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and original owners and continuing custodians of this land on which we gather today, and acknowledge the elders past and present. All right, let's head in.
Come in.
Hi, Cobus.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
That's good. So, tell us a little bit about what brought you here to conservation.
I was very interested in art and originally did an arts degree. Mainly my interest was printmaking, so etching, lithography and other media on paper. I realised pretty quickly that you really have to be passionate about art to enjoy it. And although I love art, I wasn't a passionate artist. So my other passion was actually trying to understand and look at art and trying to appreciate it, which of course gives you two career paths. One is curatorship, and as you may know, a curator is a custodian of a collection. So they look after the collection, they are the keeper of the collection, and study that collection, study the artists involved in that collection, the genre and all the rest. The other stream is conservation, and conservation is interesting because it's a blend of art and science. So I decided to be a conservator because I liked the materials and I liked the way artists think and work. So I did an applied science degree in conservation and worked for 7 years at National Gallery Victoria, and then came back to Tasmania in 2000, and I've worked here for 20 years.
Wow.
And it's still that very intimate and very privileged close examination of what an artist has done, which I enjoy the most, which most conservators do enjoy the most.
Yeah. Cool. So this is your studio where you work. And so what do you consider your primary role as a conservator?
Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery has over 1 million objects, of which probably $20,000 to $30,000 or 20 to 30,000 are works on paper. And works on paper encompass works of art on paper, watercolours, prints, drawings, archival material, documents, some books, photographic material, although photographic material is often a mixture of different things. So that essentially is what I, as a paper conservator here, are responsible for. But within that, there are a number of different curators. You know, there's a curator who's mainly involved with photographs. There's a couple of art curators. There are history curators who also deal with documents. So I deal with different curators, and paper is, of course, a very broad topic. Paper is many things.
Yeah.
So my main responsibility is I can't simply treat, and neither can my colleagues, can't treat every single object. So the main responsibility of a conservator is to prevent damage, to keep the objects in as good a condition as possible. So we spend a lot of time making sure that our storage areas are environmentally sound. We're lucky Tasmania is a very temperate climate, so our relative humidity is usually around 50%. The higher the humidity is, the more rapidly things deteriorate. The lower it is, the more they desiccate and dry out. So around 50% is really good for most things on paper. Temperature-wise, it can be colder. You know, you want to keep things in the same condition, you lower the temperature. But for human comfort, usually around 18 degrees Celsius. And so most of our storage areas are kept at that, around from 45 to 55, 60% relative humidity and around 18 degrees C. So we try to do that for another reason too. Not only does that protect the objects from deteriorating, if you want something to deteriorate fast, you put it in an oven with moisture.
Right. Yeah.
No, you put the oven setting on moist, cooking.
Yeah.
that really cooks things, which is the same as deterioration.
Yeah.
We don't want to do that. So we keep that environment right for that point of view, but also because insects love high humidity. So it also helps us with pest control, and pest control is really important. We don't use chemicals as little as possible. We do a little bit of peripheral spraying in the corners of floors to stop insects coming in. And then we just basically rely on good housekeeping. So things are clean. We make sure things are without insects when they come into the collection. We inspect them. If we have a problem with insects, we treat it in a as low chemical way as possible.
Yeah.
So prevention is the main thing.
Yeah.
That we try to
So
do.
is that the conservation side of things? So you've got conservation, so looking after the artworks and making sure that they last for a long time, essentially.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that obviously people want to see these artworks. So how do we go about lending things out to curators to put on the floor in the museum if they need to be kept in these conditions?
Sure. We now have, museums have been around for about 100 years and we've learnt from many mistakes, as have conservators. But museums have also learnt from many mistakes. The British Museum in particular, very early in its history, realised that light was really detrimental for paper.
Yeah.
Paper is an organic material, so light is energy. Even if you remove ultraviolet light from the wavelengths projected on the object so you can see it and appreciate it, light is energy, and energy helps to break organic matter down. And unfortunately, oxygen also helps to break organic matter down. Light and oxygen really speed that process up. If you've ever taken a bite out of an apple, you notice it goes brown really fast. Well, that's oxidation, and oxidation is what we see with a lot of works. For example, this is a really sad example of a work that, even though it's on a good quality paper, and that's another thing, the integrity of the material that artists use. This is a good quality paper, it's an etching. It's been stuck onto a piece of masonite, which ironically, excuse me, hasn't damaged the work so much. What's damaged it is that it's been put on display for years and years and years, and the paper is discoloured brown.
Yeah.
So basically it's cooked.
So you're saying this bit here is the bit that's been...
That's the bit that's been exposed.
Right, so essentially you can see the different colour of what the paper should look like how it's discoloured.
There's been a mount over the white bit protecting it, and the rest has been exposed. Now, I can do some things with this to reduce the staining, which then comes to restoration rather than conservation. But it's very difficult to reduce the stain like this because it's actually totally changed the structure of the paper. It's aged it. It's the difference between an uncooked chicken leg and a cooked chicken leg. So while some stain reduction can occur, it's problematic. So this is what we try to prevent. And in terms of a museum and art gallery, we learnt very early that works on paper should only be on display for short periods of time, that the light levels should be low. People might get a little bit frustrated sometimes when they walk into an area where there's works on paper and the light levels are very low, but we try to ease people into those low light levels. We usually try to display things on works on paper about 50 lux, 50, 60 lux, which is just a figure, but it's the figure that most people can discern subtleties.
Yeah.
And all this is about trying to preserve a finite resource, because we want to preserve this work, not just for this generation, but for future generations.
Yeah.
So it's about making sure light levels are low, it's making sure that it's not on display for too long, and also there's a lot of standardisation. Some things have frames attached to them that need to stain those frames because it's part of them, but most works on paper don't actually have that. So the British Museum started a standard process which helps us to protect the works and also store them efficiently. So you may know or have heard of Nicholas Solander, who was a botanist who accompanied Joseph Banks and James Cook to Australia. Nicholas Solander devised a box for the British Museum called a Solander box, which this is an example of. Great boxes, they have a lip, which means you can seal it. It's sealed well so insects can't get in, light can't get in. There's standard sizes. This is a 16 by 22 inch size. So we then put works on paper into this Solander box in mounts of that size. And then we wish to exhibit them, and I have to add here that these works on paper mounted in archival card. Once again, you want to have material of the highest quality. This is a 4-ply 100% cotton alkaline buffered card, so its pH is around 7.5, which means it's really stable. Mounting something like this means people can look at it without actually touching it. So if you're looking at lots of works on paper, you can transfer them to one side of the sander box as you go.
Yeah.
Provides a clean, safe surface. And then for frames, we have standard size frames, and these are very Blackwood, quite robust frames that we can easily assemble and disassemble without putting holes in them, so they have battens, and very easily you can mount an exhibition very quickly and safely using this method.
Great. And we saw the salamander boxes at the herbarium with Miguel.
Yeah. And just an example of the sort of damage that light can also do. This is a watercolour by G.T.W. Boyce, who was painted probably the 1840s, on display for a very long time. It's of a scene here in Hobart. And what often happens with these watercolours when they've been displayed for a long time, some of the colours tend to fade more than others. So this looks very kind of golden and ochreish. But actually when you lift up the mount once again, you can see that there was once a blue sky. And unfortunately blues tend to fade very quickly. Often in this period the blue watercolour was indigo, which is a vegetable dye, which tends to fade very fast. So you can have a very dour painting, which was originally not dour at all. And excuse me. Another example, sometimes people will mix blue and yellow to make green, and the yellow will fade, so you'll end up with blue, or the blue will fade and you end up with yellow.
Right.
So it can really throw the balance of work out. Now I can't fix that, unfortunately. I can't repaint that area.
Yeah.
So that's something that I can't do anything about.
Yeah. Yeah, great. And we've got something set up over here as well that we want to take a look at.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I might get you just, maybe you could stand there if you like.
Yeah.
So next year, our Senior Creative Art, Jane Stewart, is hoping to have an exhibition on the colonial artist Thomas Griffith Wainwright. Wainwright was a convict, a very gifted artist who was sent here for forgery in 1839 and died in 1847. He was also known as the Poisoner. It's a very long, convoluted story, but after 2 years on a road gang, Wainwright worked at the Colonial Hospital and eventually got a pardon, a ticket of leave and then a pardon. And he was able for a few years, 2 or 3 years, to professionally paint the great and the good of Hobart, if you like. So we have about nine portraits in our collection, watercolours by Wainwright. This is one of Mrs. Wilson, probably painted in 1846. And this is a sad example of something that's been restored. I have no documentation on the restoration, and that's not a criticism of the restorer. He or she have probably tried to save it and do the best they can. This work was stuck to a piece of cardboard, much like this. Very poor quality, strawboard. It was also, as you can see from the original photograph, quite stained. There was a very unsightly stain around Mrs. Wilson's nose and some at the edges as well. To reduce staining like that, you really have to get it off its secondary support. In other words, you have to get it off the cardboard. Because it's a watercolour, you have to be very careful with moisture, although older watercolours tend to be less water sensitive. So with something like this, the first thing you do is a whole lot of solubility tests to see what you can use and what you can't use, and I realised that water was a bit of a problem with this. So I had to remove the cardboard from the back dry using a poultice, and with a scalpel I removed it over about 3 or 4 weeks, very, very slowly, intermittently, taking off all the cardboard till I was right down to the back of the original support. And then, because there are lots of tears in it, small tears and losses, conservators prefer to repair things with small repairs, and we use materials like Japanese tissue, which you can take a photograph of later on. Japanese tissues are very thin, strong, very stable, made from cellulose, so very stable, long fibred, actually made by living natural treasures often in Japan. They're quite expensive, but they're very beautiful. So I use Japanese tissues and starch paste, wheat starch paste. In this case I had to line it, so that meant sticking a sheet onto the back of this to keep all the repairs together and all the losses together, and then drying it so it's nice and flat and stretching it because it needs to go back into its frame, and also it needs a bit of tension. I've created a little strainer for it out of, or rather I should say one of our technicians very kindly created a wooden strainer for me, and onto it I've stuck a sheet of mount board, which is archival, and this is the lining paper which I've stretched around it and adhered to the back. So it keeps it nice and flat because the paper is quite inconsistent because of all the damage it had succumbed to. So now this will return to its original frame, and I've retouched it in some areas with some pastel, but the stains have been reduced, and I was able to reduce the staining using deionized water and some other chemicals, not bleaching, just by washing it. And I can do that either on damp blotters or on a device I have which is called a vacuum suction table, which is over here, which I can connect up to a pump which is further away, and then using blotters I can very carefully wash it on that without getting it too wet. You obviously can't immerse it in a tray, but doing it that way you can suck some of that stain through and reduce those areas just enough. The idea is to always go just enough, not too far.
Yeah, right. Wow, there's a lot to that process, and a lot of
there is.
Yeah, a lot of science. And it's interesting, I suppose, talking about the tissue paper, because I wouldn't think that tissue paper is something that would be. I would think of a thicker paper as something that's more reliable.
If you have a look over here, I can show you some of the materials that we use. This is wheat starch powder that I cook up into a paste, so it becomes quite a strong paste. You can dilute it quite a lot, and it's what most paper conservators use. And then these are the Japanese tissues, a whole range of them. Some are thicker than others. So as you can see, they're very long fibre and have a really nice feathered edge. So they're very light. They come in quite large sheets, and they come in all sorts of different types and sizes too. And they're very stable, so they're very useful to use. If various brushes, it's often Japanese brushes, brush like this is quite handy to paste out large areas, and smaller normal brushes that people are familiar with. Pastel, try not to use too much pastel, but I don't know if I mentioned it, but one of the ethical constraints for conservators, anything we do should be as removable as possible. It's impossible to have everything removable, but if you've got a very unsightly area where the media has been lost, either because of silverfish damage or something else, you can use some pastel, and you use that pastel by putting it first on the card, then using a brush to pick it up and to just dot it in areas just to reduce the visual distraction a bit. And that pastel can be removed very carefully, not totally, but enough to fit the ethical constraints that we're dealing with. The whole idea is for somebody to look at the work, and the human eye is very trained to see problems, so close examination will always show restoration work, but the idea is to sort of try to give a viewer as close as possible a vision of what the artist wanted them to see, and then they may see the damage, So there are other various things too. For archival material, we often use a material called polyethylene terephthalate, which is a plastic, very stable plastic. You can enclose documents in there, even something that's quite unstable like newsprint. If you enclose in a mylar sleeve and you reduce the level of oxygen, it actually deteriorates more slowly. Even the newsprint is inherently unstable. It's got a lot of the ligneous material from about 50% of a tree is cellulose, the rest is other stuff. When they make newsprint, they leave the other stuff in, plus other chemicals, which tends to make it deteriorate quickly. But if you reduce air from even unstable materials, sometimes they just remain flexible and last a lot longer. So this is a good way to then handle something that's quite fragile, because it's actually fully enclosed, which is quite useful. This is Rosny, which I use quite a lot. It's actually exactly the same material as this, polyethylene terephthalate, but it's spun, and it's very good for drying things. It won't stick to paper. So when I'm, if I do wash something or get something very wet and I want to press it and dry it, I'll use felts and Rosny and weight, put it between the Rosny and felts, and that will allow it to dry without adhering to anything.
Nice. And so, last question is, I've noticed that you're not wearing any gloves when you're handling all these things. They seem very precious. Is that a deliberate thing?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question.
Yeah.
People will often see people wearing gloves, and that's perfectly fine for some things. But with lots of works on paper, because they are so difficult to handle, the risk of causing physical damage is often greater than the risk of transferring dirt or grease to them. So as a conservator, I tend to wash my hands a lot, use clean hands, then I can feel what I'm doing, particularly when you are doing a delicate treatment on something that's very fragile. You want to feel what's happening. So usually I won't wear gloves, but if I was handling something for a more pedestrian reason, then I would wear gloves. If I was carrying a book, I'd probably wear gloves. If I was opening and looking through the book, I'd probably not wear gloves. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Well, thank you so much for bringing us in and showing us all the things in your studio. It's been really educational for me, and I'm sure for our viewers as well.
Pleasure.
So we would like to thank the Friends of TMAG for bringing you this Facebook Live, and you might have noticed that we aren't doing our Facebook Lives as frequently, so now we're bringing them to you once a month. So Wednesday at 12 o'clock you can join us on Facebook Live for our next mystery tour. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye.